Alright, in this video I thought I'd go over some of the basics that drive and govern the construction of chords and really the naming of chords. A lot of people get intimidated when they see chords with unfamiliar names, and some of those names can get quite complicated. So here's a good way to tell whether this video would be of use to you. So imagine you're playing, Imagine you're playing with some friends and they say, all right, here's a song we should learn. If you've listened to much Pink Floyd, chances are you've heard this song and heard this progression. So imagine someone says to you, all right, here's how the progression goes. E minor, add 9, A suspension 4, C major 7, B minor, F major 7, D7 sharp 9, D7 flat 9, E minor. If you look at that stuff and that intimidates you and you think to yourself, oh, there's no way I can figure out what those chords are unless I break out my handy chord reference dictionary, then this lesson might be of use to you. With some basic principles, you can learn how to decipher these various chord names on your own. And there are various advantages to doing so, and those are the ones that I'll try to explain as we go along. All right. So the first place to start will be just with the basics that govern what goes into making chords. We'll start there. Now the approach I'm going to take is to show how chords are constructed out of and based off of scales. Let's start with basic E major scale. And this is, again, it's one of the things that you memorize. Just like you learn when you're playing a guitar, you learn different chord shapes. One of the things you learn and memorize is the pattern for a major scale. So let's just do an E major scale. It will look like this. Now, a scale's got 7 notes. The 8th note is the octave. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, octave. Now let's think about the names of them. So E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D sharp, E. Alright, those are what make up the E major scale. When it comes to figuring out how to play chords, the first thing to keep in mind is that there are principles that govern the construction of chords. Major chords use the first note of the scale, the 3rd note of the scale, and the 5th note of the scale. So E, G sharp, and B are the 3 notes that make up the E major chord. So if you think about how you probably learned to play, one of the first chords you maybe learned to play, an E major. You've got your E, B, E again, G sharp, B, E. That is the last 2 notes, just last 2 strings, not fretted at all. So it's just those 3 notes, but they're replicated. If you fret the chord up at the 7th fret, same thing. E, B, E, G sharp, B. So you, again, major chords are based off of the 1, the 3, and the 5. Minor chords are based off of the 1, the flat 3, and the 5. So go back to our scale. Our major scale looked like this. There's our 3rd. To say it's flat in 3rd just means it's 1 step lower. Instead of it being G sharp, in other words, it would be G. Go back and look at what an E minor chord looks like. E, B, E, and now the G note, the G string, is open. Instead of fretting it to get the G sharp, you've got the open string. So again, a minor chord is based off of just the 1, the flat 3, and the 5. And that's something you can just get those notes from the scale. If you don't believe me, try the same major scale pattern for an A. The 1, the 3, and the 5 for an A will give you the chords you need for an A major. A, C sharp, and E. Now, chords get much more complicated from that. When you're playing basically rock music, you're often just using major chords. But when you start getting towards blues and jazz, you find that there are seventh chords as well, chords that have a seventh in them. And there are two basic kinds of seventh chords that we're going to talk about now. That's going to, again, make use of the seventh note in the scale that I had showed you before. All right, so I'm going to talk about that next. Now, when it comes to seventh chords, chords that have seventh in them, there are really two basic kinds. There's what's known as major seventh and dominant seventh. Major seventh chords are named with major 7. So if you see something like E major 7, or in that progression I showed you at the beginning, C major 7th. But dominant seventh chords, the way they're written, is they're usually just written with the letter of the chord and then the 7. So D7, for instance, would be the way in which people symbolize a dominant 7th, or E7th, as opposed to E major 7th. Well, what's the difference? Well, let's go back to our scale. There's our octave. Here's our 7th. In an E major scale, the 7th note of that scale is a D sharp. A major 7th chord uses that 7th, uses that D sharp. So let's go back to how we fretted the E chord. We're going to have 4 notes. We're going to have the 1, the 3, the 5. That's what goes into a major chord, but now it's a major 7th. So we're going to have a 4th note added. It's going to be the 7th. Now, how are we going to find room to get that extra note in there? Which extra note? The D sharp. Well, think about what your D sharp is. Here's your D up here. So there's D sharp. You can always use this little trick of finding the octave. 2 frets down and 2 strings down. So that's actually a D sharp. This shape here, here's our E major, here's the little modification. We simply just go from the E here to the D sharp. That's an E major 7th. Now, as I mentioned, there's another kind of 7th. Dominant 7th. The difference between a major 7th and a dominant 7th is that in a dominant 7th, you don't use the 7th note, you use the flattened 7th note. Just as when we talked about the minor chord, we took that 3 and we dropped it down half a step. We went from G sharp to G. Now we're going to go from our 7th, which was, in the major scale, was D sharp, and we're going to drop it down to D. Now, when it comes to actually fretting that, the dominant 7th, like the major 7th, it's going to be based off of 4 notes. The 1, the 3, the 5, and the flat 7. So we're going to have E, B, G sharp, and now we're going to have D. This is a way to get it all in there. We got our B here, here's our E, here's our G sharp. On our 3rd string, we got that. What's that? That's our D. Then we got, up here, we got our E again. Now that way of doing it, and just ignore the 1st string, that gets all of them in there. A lot of times people just leave out the B, just because it's easier to fret, and you can get the feel of it just by ignoring that B. might sound familiar. So there's that sound. E dominant 7th versus E major 7th. Again, both of them are based off of 4 notes. The difference between them is whether that 7th is the regular 7th or the flattened 7th. Now you can go on and you can build minor 7th chords out of there, but I'll leave that as something for you to figure out. Think of the minor 7th as a variation of the dominant 7th, but you're going to add the minor note to it. So see if you can figure that on your own. And I'm going to go on to some of the stuff that really confuses people when you start seeing extra numbers in there, like sus4 or add 9 or sharp 9. All right? All right, here's a way to get over your fear of those extra numbers, especially if you start looking at jazz chords. You see people talking about 9ths, and sharp 9ths, and 11ths, and 13ths. Well, where is that coming from? Well, let's just look at the major scale we started with and how I numbered them. So we had E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D sharp was our 7th, E was the octave. Just call that 8. Well, just keep counting. Just keep going with the scale. Repeat it, and then just keep counting. So F sharp, we can consider that the 9th. Well, that's just our second note from before. It's just repeated, because we're just counting again and again. Just like G sharp is 10, that's just the third. In other words, take the numbers we had for our first, add 7th to them, and you get those numbers again. So if we talked about a chord that was, say, an E minor, add 9, we know we're going to make use of the F sharp. So let's actually look at how that would go, since that was one of the ones in the progression we had. We had an E minor, E, B, E, G, and then B and E. Now it says E minor, add 9. Well, what are you supposed to do? Well, you take the notes that make the E minor and you find a way to get, in addition to that, the 9. Well, what's the 9? Well, we just said it was the F sharp. Look around. Where is an F sharp located up here? Well, one's up there. Here's another place where we've got F sharp. Here. So it's here and also here. Can we get a chord that gets them all in there? Yeah, how about this one? Here's our E, B, F sharp, G, because it was a minor, B, and E. So all I'm fretting is that note, the B, and then this note, the F sharp, and leaving everything else open. Now if that sounds familiar, gives you a clue of where we're going. All right, so there's one way to start dealing with those extra numbers. Now how about something like a suspended chord? Something like A sus2 or A sus4, as you'll often see. Well, all that's going on when you see an A sus2 or a D sus2 or sus4 is what they're officially known as suspensions. And guitar players talk about them a little bit differently than piano players. But the key is really leave out the third that we talked about and instead add in either the second or the fourth, depending on whether it's a sus2 or a sus4. So let's talk about an A chord. An A chord, A major chord, our 1 and our 3 and our 5 would be, you just do the scale if you want, A, B, C sharp, D, E. So we got our 1, A, our 3 is C sharp, and our 5 is the E. And that's in fact what you get. Now if we left out the third, if we left out the C sharp, and we were looking for an A sus2, well, what do we put in its place? We put in the number 2. Well, what's number 2 in that scale? B. How would you do it? Well, just leave out that C sharp and make it B. How about A sus4? Well, take your A, and now, instead of using the C sharp, which was our 3, use the 4 in your scale. What was the 4? Well, go through the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4. D. So make the A and get the D note. That is, just fret it like that. Put your finger on the D note there. So here's what we've got so far in that little progression. A, sus 4, back to the A. Alright, now let's move on to the more complicated part of that progression that I had mentioned. And in that progression that I had started off with, the next chord was a C major 7th. So think about what we just talked about. You take a major chord and you're going to use the 7th. So think about a C major scale. There's our C we start with. Here's our C that we end with. What would be the 7th? It would be the B. So we want a chord that's got the 1, the 3, the 5, and the regular 7th. So look at a C shape chord. We got our C here. We got to find a way to get a B in there. Well, here's the other place where C is used. Up here on the 2nd string. Just leave that out and fret it like this. That's C major 7th. You're letting the B ring, and that's your 7th. Then the next chord was a B minor. I shouldn't throw you. Make the B, flatten the 3rd. And the next one was an F major 7th. So again, think about an F scale. Let's do it up all the way up here, just so you can see all the way up at the 13th fret. There's our F, What's the 7th? It's E. So how are we going to get that in there? Well, fret your full F. Got your F down here. We also got your F here. So we've got F in there. We've got an F, more Fs to spare. Here's F as well on the 1st string. Just leave that one open. Instead of F, in other words, use the 7th of that scale, which would be E. That's F major 7th. Right. Now we hit the trickiest parts. All right. The ones that are the D7 sharp 9 and the D7 flat 9. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to first introduce you to what people often refer to as the Hendrix chord, because this is really just a variation of the so-called Hendrix chord. So let me explain that now. All right, here's what I mean by what people call the Hendrix chord. It's got this strange shape, but if you listen to it, you probably recognize it. Let's go the reverse route. Let's take the notes and try to figure out what to call it. So we've got our E here. We got that. That's our G sharp. What's this one here? Well, that's D. So E, G sharp, D. Now, if it's a D as opposed to a D sharp, that should make us think, oh, it's a kind of E7th chord. We got our 1, we got our 3, we got our flat 7th. Then we got this note. What's that? That's a G. And the final note that's got in there, which people often leave out, is we got the B up here. So we've got our 1, 3, and our 5. E, G sharp, B. We've also got our D, which makes it kind of a dominant 7th. And we've also got this extra note, G. Now go back to the little counting rubric I had before. If you were counting the notes, well, 9 is F sharp. 9 is F sharp. How about G? Well, G would be the sharpened 9. And in fact, that's what the Hendrix chord is known as. It's E7 sharp 9. E seventh sharp 9. So think about what that means. It's a seventh chord, like we showed before, but now we add an even extra note to it, namely this one, the G, which is our F sharp, which would be our 9, but we sharpen it, that is, we go up a step to get our G. Now, in the progression that I had shown you, we use not an E7 sharp 9, but we use the D7 sharp 9. So you just take that shape and you slide it down. Now we've got the same pattern, but now we start at the D. Last chord, we go from a D7 sharp 9 to a D7 flat 9. Now when it comes to fretting it, if we're starting with a D chord and we're coming up with a variation of a D chord, and we're thinking about the 9 of a D chord, well, think about what the second note would be in a D scale. If we were doing our D major scale, we have D, our second note would be E. So the 9th of a D major scale would be E. The sharpened version of an E would be F. That's what we would have here. This would be our D7 sharp 9 with our F here. But instead, we want a flat 9. So we drop it down 2 frets. What's a flattened 9? Well, instead of E, we go down to an E flat or a D sharp. So instead of this, we go from sharp 9 to flat 9, where we get that note in there. All right, let's put it all together after all that work. See what we got. Now, in fact, I actually threw in an extra chord there because I forgot to list it, which was just the G after the F major 7th. But if you recognize that, that's just a nice transition out of the song Breathe by Pink Floyd. Now, the key through all this, just as a reminder, the key through all this was when you're building and making sense of chords, even with their crazy names, is just remember the scale. Remember the scale and how chords are based off of the scale and the numbers that you can assign to the notes in your scale. And depending on whether you're flattening them or using the straight up note, the natural note, you can get the difference between major chords, minor chords, dominants, major 7ths, move on to expand to much more complicated chords from there. Those are the fundamentals. All right, hope that was of some use. Take it easy.